Well, welcome again to another of our November lecture series. My name is Chuck Smythe, and I'm the director of the Culture and History Department here at Sealaska Heritage Institute. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind you, like in a movie theater, to check your phones. And please be sure that they're turned off for ringers and things like that. And if you haven't picked up a lecture schedule, there's one out on the table. We have a few more remaining coming up in the last week of November after Thanksgiving. So you're welcome to come back then. But today I'm happy to introduce Saankaláxt Ernestine Hayes, Alaska Writer Laureate and Professor of English at University of Alaska Southeast. She is best known as the author of the American Book Award recipient Blonde Indian, an Alaskan Native Memoir, which also received the Honoring Alaska Indigenous Literature Award and was finalist for the Kiriyama Prize and the Penn Nonfiction Award. Her latest book, The Tao of Raven, places fiction and nonfiction narratives in the context of Raven and the Box of Daylight series, Daylight, and Sun Tzu's The Art of War. So that's kind of an interesting combination. She speaks from her Southeast Native perspective on topics related to culture and history and contributes to the public narrative based on her experiences. Today, the title of her talk is The Names We Carry. She will discuss the ways in which the cultural practice of carrying names has impacted her work, her life, and the work and lives of others, and the ways in which social names perpetuate cultural values. She will give examples from her writing that illustrate the substance of the names we carry and the power of the names that carry us. I'm very pleased to introduce you, so please, I look forward to hearing.
Gunnish, it's so great to be here, such an honor to be invited. I would first like to acknowledge the Kaagwaantaan people upon whose land we stand, and upon whose land it has been my family's privilege and honor to live for 7 counted generations. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Alaska Heritage Institute, Rosita Worrell, and honored elders, Gunnish, friends, relatives, honored guests, Gunnish. Before I begin my talk on the names we carry, it is my practice always in every opportunity to make 2 points. If you have heard these points before, please bear with me. However, I do not apologize. First, almost every source describes the long record of native use and occupation that took place before European contact as prehistory. Indigenous groups, however, possess histories of thousands of years of occupancy and exodus, relocation and settlement, exploration and discovery, embedded throughout the generations in legal process, artistic declarations, symbolic regalia, and oral traditions, at least as accurately and in many cases more accurately than the European system of writing that has been used for so many years to remove rights and appropriate lands. We must always remember that before colonial contact, Native cultures possessed vigorous legal systems, effective educational systems, efficient health systems, elaborate social orders, elegant philosophical and intellectual insights, sophisticated kinship systems, complex languages, profitable trade systems, every social institution needed for a culture to flourish for thousands of years. Second, We do well to remind ourselves that had the colonial invasion not taken place, Indigenous people would still be living in the 21st century. Our lives would still be modern. Paved roads, airports, and electricity would still occur. Some things would be different. We would all be speaking our own languages. Our children would be receiving educations meant to lead to their success. We would not be so vulnerable to incarceration, alcoholism, poverty. We would be healthy. Tlingit Kainach Saankaláxt Yuchattuasak. Dleidka Kainach Ernestine Hayes Yuchattuasak. Chak na ayakat, Kaagwaantaan ayakat, Gooch Hít ayakat, Ganach tedi dachhan hatsati, Yanwasha, Sheetgakwan. Tlingit Kainach Saankaláxt Yuchattuasak. My Tlingit name is Saankaláxt. Dleidka Kainach Ernestine Hayes Yuchattuasak. My white man name is Ernestine Hayes. Chak na ayakat. I am Eagle. Kaagwaantaan ayakat. I am of the Burnt House People Clan. Gooch Hít ayakat. I belong to the Wolf House. Ganach tedi dachhan hatsati. I am a grandchild of the Ganach tedi. Yanwasha. I am a Kaagwaantaan woman who traces her lineage through Klakwaan. Sheetgakwan, my clan springs from Sitka. My mother's name was Kaagwaantaan, Irma Daisy Hayes. My grandmother's name was Saudu'u, Ruth Willard Hayes. My great-grandmother's name was Kaagwaantaan, Anna Edwards Willard. My great-great-grandmother's name has not yet revealed itself to me. Ruth Willard Hayes, Saudu'u, the woman who raised me while my mother was in and out of the hospital, the woman who told me stories and helped me see the world, was clan sister to the woman who might be termed my biological grandmother, who died when my own mother was a baby. Her name was Saankaláxt, whose Tlingit name I carry. I was said to be such a hungry newborn that I could not be satisfied at my mother's breast. My mother Kaagwaantaan and my grandmother Saudu'u realized that I must be my great-grandmother trying to be put back into the world. My great-grandmother Kaagwaantaan had died from a cancer that prevented her from being able to eat during her last weeks. But by the time the women in my family understood, I had already been given the name of my true grandmother, who had died of tuberculosis when my mother was herself a baby. I carry the white man name of my grandfather, Ernest Leonard Hayes. Tlingit genealogy indicates that he was Hít clan from the Yunyadi clan of the Takuquan. His mother's name is said to have been Saankaláxt. His grandmother's name is recorded as Saankaláxt, also said to be known as Tugboat Annie and Juno. I acknowledge Harold Jacobs' comprehensive work preserving our history in this way. People who come back into the world often announce their return in dreams, or make themselves known by marks or behavior in their newborn form. This story and its recognition of the significance of naming is acknowledged in Blonde Indian in this way. Birth. The birth of a child, the birth of Raven, the birth of the new world with the summer's return of the salmon. The young bears come out of their warm hiding places where they listen to their mothers sing to them and tell them the stories of the bear people. Baby birds inside their shells listen to the cries and the airs of their fathers and their mothers. They know from the sounds through the shells that the screams of eagles in the high air, the mimicking of the ravens on the branches, the quiet music of the fearless chickadee are the stories of their people. They prepare to enter the world, They listen to the songs and the stories so they will be ready. They will be born knowing their own songs and their own stories. They will know their own names. By the mark, the child's real name is known. By the name, the child is known. Like Raven, the scars we are born with today are not always easily seen. My mother was born with little piercings on her ears. By this she was known to be her own maternal ancestor. By those marks she was recognized and given her proper name, Kaagwaantaan. I was not born with a recognizable mark. My scars were not on my skin. I was such a hungry baby, my mother said, it was thought that I must be my maternal great-grandmother who had died the year before I was born and who had not been able to eat at the end of her life. She must have been hungry, it was reasoned. That, my mother told me, was a late indication of who I really was. But by then I had already been given my maternal grandmother's real name, Saankaláxt. She too died before I was born. It was her sister who became my grandmother. She too was named Saudu. It was Saudu who told me stories, and it was she who taught me songs. Those stories, those songs, those names, the names of the people and the places carry history, carry meaning, carry the knowledge of who we are. It's no wonder, then, that changing personal and place names was and continues to be such an essential step in colonization and remains important to the reinforcement and perpetuation of colonialism today. Names. Naming. Personal Tlingit names belong to the clan. It was once quite common to be able to recognize the clan to which someone belonged, to name their relatives and to locate their ancestral land simply by knowing that person's given name. Tlingit Kainak Saankaláxt Yuchatu Sak. My mother's brother, Eugene King, carries the name Anahoots. One of my sons carries the name Yaquan, which is also the name of Cecilia Kunz's father. That name, the name carried by Cecilia Kunz's father, the name carried by my uncle Ernest Leonard Hayes Jr., the name carried by my son, Yaquan, establishes the relationship between our families, a relationship I commemorated in a passage from the Tao of Raven. My grandmother Saudu was always a tough old woman ready for any challenge. Even after my mother and I left Alaska, even after we heard the unwelcome news of her death, even after I sat for hours with her memory, recreating the years she fed me soup and told me stories and washed my clothes. She was only the imposing gray-haired woman who taught me I was eagle, told me bears were my cousins, reminded me that the wind was my grandfather. She often declared that our family carried powerful names, but I never saw in her the youthful bearing that comes with the noble birth she claimed. A few years ago, a Raven relative gave me a photograph I had never seen. Gunnachish. My young grandmother poses with confidence, dressed in the latest white man ruffles, shoes, hair, and jewelry, slick, modern, rich. Behind her, an embroidered cloth brushes against the polished arm of the leather chair on which she rests her hand. Behind her could have been a flowered dish awaiting her dignified touch. She always favored decorated platters. Before her was a long path lined with tumult and sorrow. But in that moment, she must have thought that her station in the world she was entering would be equal to the one she was leaving. She must have thought that she would meet every new challenge. She must have thought she was entering a world where high-born Tlingit women were respected where ruffles danced like chilcat fringe, where sunflowers bloomed in dark rainforest gardens. My grandmother's name was Saudu'u, Ruth Willard Hayes. Hinkit Kanak Saankaláxt Yuchatuasa. Western names are also carried in my family. Hazel, which is my middle name. Maxine, the name of one of my aunts. Benjamin, an uncle who died when he was still a baby. Ernest, the name of one of my uncles and my grandfather. Albert, the name of one of my uncles. Ruth, the name of one of my aunts and my grandmother. And Tlingit names, Saankaláxt, Koch, Kwe, Saudu, Anna, Hoots, Yaquan. Names not only establish family relationships and our relationship with one another as individuals, but also our relationship with groups such as clans and with places, as exemplified in the words of my introduction that say, Sitka, my clan springs from Sitka. Naming in the Western tradition is similar, as we would expect. Worldwide naming practices communicate information about individual identity, group identity, place. For example, in the Western tradition, it's the common practice for a woman to be marked with the name of her husband, no longer to be known by her father's name. A practice reflected in the act of answering the question, who gives this woman? By a paternal figure walking a woman down the aisle to her new husband, symbolically transferring ownership, giving her away, transferring property, placing a name upon her to announce her identity and to signify changed ownership. Western traditions of naming places are also similarly constructed to reveal ownership. For example, on the easternmost coast of this continent, many place names include the word new. New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New England. Many indigenous names persist as well, although their original meaning and culture have been subsumed, and in many cases their indigenous roots are no longer recognized. Idaho, Minnesota, Dakota, Oklahoma, Ohio, Alaska. Place names in Alaska are a curious blend of colonial imposition and indigenous existence. Anchorage, Fairbanks, McKinley, Angoon, Zentikahini, Denali, Seward, Douglas, Juneau. Place names are not limited to city names, as demonstrated in the name transformations of the Great Mountain Denali. Last summer, I was fortunate to be invited to Healy to give a talk and offer writing workshops. I took advantage of the opportunity to travel on the Alaska Railroad both ways. On the return trip to Anchorage, the narrator, an older fellow who was careful to let passengers know how long he had lived in Alaska, insisted on repeatedly referring to the mountain as Mount McKinley. A few times he attached the actual name Denali to his insistence, but those references were infrequent and they were dismissive. It was clear that in his opinion, naming a place for the prominent descendant of Irish settlers was proper, and acknowledging the ancient place name was not. We see that sort of behavior all over colonized territories. Names of Alaska mountains and Alaska places and Alaska towns and Alaska neighborhoods and Alaska town districts are not unknown, although as a rule, villages retain their original names. Mountains, on the other hand, are susceptible to the colonial practice of naming after settlers and their descendants, as are the names of islands. For example, Prince of Wales. Bodies of water, Disenchantment Bay, Gold Creek, and parts of our town, the Flats, Chicken Ridge, Star Hill, the Willoughby District. I began my talk with 2 points that it is my custom to repeat at every opportunity. Another common passage I sometimes include is a thought exercise in which I ask audiences to imagine what would happen if in the space of the next few years, this American culture was suddenly subdued by another culture that believed theirs was a superior way of living, their language the only worthwhile speech, their history the only history that mattered. I ask audiences to imagine what would happen if this young American society, less than 250 years old, suddenly was rocked by cultural trauma. I admit that it's unthinkable, but our challenge is to suspend our disbelief for a moment, to consider what would happen to our grandchildren's children if in the span of the next 50 or 60 years, a killing blow was delivered to the way of life we now know. It's relevant to today's discussion to wonder what we would do if we could no longer speak the English language, if our daily activities were conducted in a new language we didn't understand, if our laws were swept away and replaced with an unfamiliar language, if the names of our buildings and our neighborhoods were so seemingly and suddenly changed. Our children would be taken from us and given unpronounceable new names. Familiar places with names that carried history and relationship and value and worth. Names that memorialized important events and signified characteristics of that place would be changed to glorify someone we did not know. According to local history, Richard Gentry Willoughby was at the first gold strike in nearby Silver Bowl Basin by December 1880. Throughout the years of his presence here, Willoughby staked claims up and down the Juneau Gold Belt and in other parts of what was by then called Alaska and British Columbia. He enjoyed varying degrees of success in his search for gold. His greatest claim, though, has proven to be an enterprise called the Silent City. Willoughby claimed that he took a photograph of a silent city in the mists of what by then was called Muir Glacier. Willoughby hypothesized that the photograph in his possession could be the reflection of a Russian city thousands of miles away, miraculously seen through the magical glacial mist. It was soon discovered that the photo was actually the picture of an English city, a photo that Willoughby had purchased from a stranger, but his trickery was only discovered after Willoughby had sold a number of prints to gullible tourists who were convinced that Willoughby could see Russia from his house. Muir Glacier. We all know that Muir Glacier is named after a person by the name of John Muir, a person immigrated to Wisconsin from Scotland at the age of 11 who fancied in 1879 that he had discovered a place now called Glacier Bay. In Hashuka, our ancestors, Chukanshaduktantanyarikaske, also known as Susie James, begins the story of Glacier Bay history in this way. The name of it is Gatineau, that land of ours. Gatineau, the bay where the glacier was. It was where people lived. Salmon of all kinds ran there. That's why the people lived there. They made it a village. Many kinds of salmon are there. good salmon ran there. It was while people were still living there. The houses, maybe as many as 5 houses stood there, the houses. The Kaagwaantaan and the Gooch and the Hít and us, those of us who are Chukanedi. We were living there. It's important to note that in her version of Glacier Bay history in Hashuka, Susie James begins the story with an invocation of place. Her first line, Gatini Yua Weduasak, names the land. And the second line, We Hasani, establishes the relationship between the land and the people. Invocation of place is a common theme in Native literature and does not function simply as a location marker. As David Abram observes in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, an engaging scholarly study of breath and words and magic, a particular place in the land is never, for an oral culture, just a passive or inert setting for the human events that occur there. It is an active participant in those occurrences. Indeed, by virtue of its underlying and enveloping presence, the place may even be felt to be the source, the primary power that expresses itself through the various events that unfold there. In the history of the place that is now called Glacier Bay, the introductory identification of the land explicitly establishes the landscape as a principal actor in the events that are about to unfold. The landscape, the place, participates in the events that happen there, that take place there. Downauer explains that the literal translation of the title of the history is When the Glacier Comes Down on the People. The name Gatini is Sockeye River, now called Bartlett Cove. Downauer tells us that the name Glacier Bay was not traditionally applied to the area, but its name in Tlingit means the edge of the clay. So named because the entire bay was a valley of clay covered with grass. Downauer goes on to explain that after the glacier came down and had receded, it became the bay where the glacier was. Sit-itige. This short note exemplifies the practice of place names that commemorate significant events or that reflect important characteristics of that place. Tlingit, Gainach, Saankaláxt, Yuchat. Records from the year 1794, kept by a person under the captaincy of an explorer by the name of George Vancouver, after whom many landmarks along the coast were named by European travelers, indicate that the entrance to what is now called Glacier Bay was ice-choked. In fact, the body of water is now named Icy Strait. Almost 100 years later, a naturalist by the name of John Muir wrote in his journals that the glaciers had receded from Icy Strait for a distance of more than 30 miles. The movement that represents this latest glacial retreat is among the most thoroughly studied geological events in modern time. The photographic records are comprehensive, as are collections of specific interest to botanists, climatologists, and other scholars. And an understanding of the movement and history of that place, along with the world view of the original people, is illuminated by the Glacier Bay narratives and by the continuation of those original names. In the context of narrative of Glacier Bay history, place occupies a traditional role. Place is not the stage upon which these events occur, but is rather an active participant in human events. As David Abram asserts in his text on the relationship between humans and the environment, the stories told within an oral culture are often deeply bound to the earthly landscape inhabited by that culture. The stories are profoundly and indissolubly place-specific. For meaningful speech is not, in an oral culture, experienced as an exclusively human capacity, but as a power of the enveloping earth itself, in which humans participate. The singular magic of a place is evident from what happens there, from what befalls oneself or others when in its vicinity. To tell of such events is implicitly to tell of the particular power of that site, and indeed to participate in its expressive potency. The landscape, the place, participates, commemorates, holds. The glacier that is central to the story of Glacier Bay history is an extension of place. It is the consciousness possessing catalyst that necessitates the people's flight. When the people leave, they understand not only that the glacier is a participant in those events, but they are also aware of the reciprocal grief that their absence will cause to the house, to the river, and to the land. Those truths are expressed in the names of those places now hold. Not long ago, the Anchorage Daily News published an article about a point on a Tongass National Forest ridge just outside Juneau that had become the first geographic feature with a federally recognized name in the native language of Tlingit. Concluding a process, the Daily News explained, that was begun a decade before, when a respected former state transportation official, John Scribner, was killed in a fall from another mountain. The name of that ridge is Tlaxatanjin, a name used by the Tlingit people for hundreds of years, a name that is loosely said to be translated to "the hands are at rest." Scribner's daughter, Mandy Malott, said in a letter written to the Alaska Historical Commission that her family endorsed the Indigenous name and celebrated the recognition of Tlaxatanjin as she knew her dad would do. The story of that original name, the name of the man whose life was lost nearby, and the spirit, the generous spirit of the family who recognized the importance of the name that means the hands are at rest, are now part of the events carried in the name Tlaxatanjin. For that ridge, like all places, participates, commemorates, and holds. Like Tlingit society itself, the Juneau Indian Village and its residents have been renamed, removed, relocated, and redefined. In real ways, the experience of the Juneau Indian Village functions as a metaphor for the Alaska Native experience. From the Auk tribe building on the eastern edge of the village to the old Malaspina apartments on the west end, the Juneau Indian Village is a poignant reminder of a once thriving neighborhood where relatives shared their resources and children played on the village's only street, a reminder of a time when the significance of names was still acknowledged. Culture bearers believe that the area now known as Juneau was the site of summer activities for the Kaagwaantaan, whose territory, according to Walter Goldschmidt, extended from what is now called Thane northward to a traditional boundary, Dalhanat, now called Berners Bay. Goldschmidt was a government agent who in 1940 conducted a comprehensive study of native use and occupation of all of Tlingit Ani, now called Southeast Alaska, or the Alexander Archipelago, or the Panhandle, or the Tongass National Forest. Goldschmidt and Hawes produced their comprehensive report, which was published only a few years ago, with an insightful first introduction by Thomas Thornton, our brother. Tlingit families often made traditional use of several locations near and far. Locally, the families maintained gardens in areas that were to become government-owned public lands as well as privately owned properties. My family had a garden out in what is now Okrek. Also became privately owned properties. They used fishing sites on the north end of what is now Douglas Island. And they constructed smokehouses in places throughout the region, including southward on what is now called Gastineau Channel. After American involvement, freedom of movement was restricted not only for the Kaagwaantaan, but for all Tlingit throughout Tlingit Oni. Old fishing grounds were claimed by settlers and renamed. Berry picking sites were lost, and their names were lost. Gardens and smokehouses numbered fewer and fewer. Summer and winter home sites up and down the coast were abandoned, stolen, and renamed. Tlingit people clustered their homes in fewer places. Because of the booming mining industry and the availability of jobs and trading goods, Suntakahini became a year-round living place. As the non-native population grew, white businesses and residences were built, and native people moved their permanent dwelling places to a place that offered convenience and the closeness of family and friends. For the Kaagwaantaan and their relatives, that place became the Juneau Indian Village. In 1913, a roadway on pilings was built in front of the village. Native people living in the village were allowed to access the beach underneath the planked street if the tide was right. By the late 1930s, the planked street was torn up and replaced by rock fill and a culvert, further restricting native access to the sea, once the source of their main livelihood and a critical element of native identity. This disconnection from the ocean was echoed in the larger Alaska Native experience. In every area in the land that once was Tlingit Ani and which was becoming Southeast Alaska, Native people lost their old fishing grounds and their old places where they once collected shellfish and beach asparagus. Along with loss of access and resources, place names were lost, forgotten, and replaced. In 1941, another rock fill marked a milestone for village residents. New houses were built, new foundations laid. Houses now faced the lane that city maps reveal was first called Siwash Alley, but eventually became known by its present name, Village Street. A 1968 report by the Juneau Indian Village Improvement Committee explains the site of the Juneau Indian Village was mostly tidelands. High tides brought the sea to the bluff above Village Street. The original houses were built on pilings or higher on the hillside. It's difficult now to imagine Village Street as tideland. Few people who are young or who are new to Juneau can envision the once thriving neighborhood where relatives shared their resources and deerskins were stretched in welcoming doorways, where dogs and children once played in the street, an occasional car might now drive slowly by. But we all know the name of the planked street that first blocked native access to the beach and to the ocean. That street is called Willoughby Avenue. And that name participates, commemorates, and holds that history. Another of the streets here in Juneau is named after someone named Seward, whom Alaskans celebrate with holidays and statues and street names and city names and sesquicentennial events. In a stunning erasure of Native history and occupation, the Special Projects page for the relatively new statue of Seward that stands at the courthouse describes the design in this way, and I quote, "Coming up the hill, there is a natural visual progression. First, we see the bear and its salmon representing all that is wild here. Next is Seward offering the deed to the state. And finally, the establishment of the state embodied by the state building beyond." Completely erasing Native occupation, Native presence. Is Alaska's history to be celebrated only with monuments to colonialism? Must the names we memorialize commemorate only explorers from Scotland who happened to come to Alaska? Presidents from Ireland, tricksters selling photographs? Is it not time to stop erasing Native people, erasing Native history, erasing Native names? Working together, we can overcome the intent of colonialism. We can tell new stories. We can adopt new narratives. We can commemorate true histories. We can erect new monuments. We can acknowledge old names. We can participate in new events. We can hold new values. Join me in resisting the colonial urge to name that historic district so full of Native presence after a man named Willoughby. Join me in advocating for a district name that acknowledges, that respects, that carries our history. Join me in calling for a name that reflects our rich, beloved place. Let us not memorialize 19th century separatism, but rather 21st century unity. Let us not look back with admiration, but forward with hope. Let us not lift up the names of people who did not love this land, this place, this town, this neighborhood, this district. We can remember our traditions and be strengthened by our past. We can be made wiser by its lessons. Looking forward, we can reimagine our village, our city, our relationships, our history, our names. Let us stand together, not in a district that commemorates a street built to block Kaagwaantaan from their history and their livelihood. Let us instead take steps to ensure that the name we call that district participates in events we all value, that commemorates our full history, that holds and reflects the values we all share. Sin git enach Saankaláxt, you had to a sock. Gunneth Chish. We have some time, and I invite some of you who will share your name, share the history of your name, share your thoughts about names and your name and your history. Just today, I had a wonderful, wonderful story told to me by my relative, Eddie Coons, about what is now known as Mount Juno. And if you have names to share that tell who you are, please do so. First, oh, thank you.
My name is Stephen. I was born in Kaagwaantaan. My mother was from Saankaláxt. Her house is their house. I've done a lot of research on stuff you're talking about, but I could go deeper. I got court hearings concerning Juno, Douglas, and the village, I call it right under by the sea of Pay. The Douglas Indian village was done with no judges, no jury, no federal law. I was taken up and condemned by the council members of Douglas. I would like to find out the fact that what's the name of the village? Mine in Douglas.
Treadwell.
They pulled out $60 million worth of gold in 10 days. I mean, 12 years.
No.
And there's an article, I got it. The federal government or the state government feel they owe no money for any of these mines. You know, you're talking about Juno mine, they must have taken out $1 billion.
No.
Douglas Indian Village. All land on its highland is Indian country. I got a document through if anybody wants to see it. It would have to help me make sense of it. And my Douglas Indian Village is a little more complicated. There are 3 villages in Juneau, Alaska, I cooked, worth about $300 million apiece. The Thane village, nobody knew about it. And I didn't until about 30 years ago. I got pictures of everything I got. I have enough pictures of Thane, Douglas, and Juneau to show everybody here.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know what kind of meeting this was going to be. I still don't. People think Indians got no protection. There are laws made in 1994 will protect us from the United States itself.
Mm.
Now people think the United States is the sole United States. Where the laws are made in Congress, only they can make laws concerning Indians. Nobody knows about it. Even knows about it. Because I see them using it once in a while. I got it. I need a little bit of backing, it can be done. I do not plan on taking all of Juneau Village. I want all of Douglas. And Juneau, it seems like Juneau Indians don't want it, so I'll take some. It can happen.
Thank you. I think it'll be wonderful to see those pictures and talk to you more. Goodness, Chish, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. If someone else would like to say their name, where they came from, what their name, oh, thank you.
Yes, I had took the curry. I had Satan song. Tegen a hit of Kuhidi. The lady that's come, I had Kaagwaantaan Yadi Tsu Hatsati. I just introduced myself the way my mother taught me. I am Raven. I am Kohu. Satan is my ceremonial name. I'm from the Outwards house. The standing house is over in Sitka. I'm a grandchild of the dog salmon and a child of the Kaagwaantaan. My common name, my household name was Quetzke, and my mother tells me that's a little bird that's always running in water. I don't know what kind of bird when we go out by the beach, I always see a little bird running back and forth when the little waves come in. I think maybe that's a sandpiper. I don't know, I'm just guessing. At a party for a Koho elder here, a memorial party, I was given the name Satan, and it's a Yakutat name. I was told it means laying mountain, and it refers to Mount Fairweather. The Kohos claim Mount Fairweather. There's a dance group over in Huda called the Mount Fairweather Dancers. Oh, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, my clan leader came over to Juneau along with Andy Gamble, who was the clan leader of the Kaagwaantaan from Rangoon, Ray Wilson, who was a clan leader from Sitka, Kiksati, George Bennett, who was Tukdayton. He was a Gulkahan, or a peacemaker, Raven peacemaker, and Harold Jacobs, who was also a Gulkahan. He was a peacemaker for the Eagles. He's young Yadi. Excuse me, and Greg Dudgeon at the time was superintendent of the historical park over in Sitka. The reason he came over was because that fall there was going to be a party, a Koho party, for a lady who belonged to the Koho clan. But the house that she belonged to, Digging Hít, had no speaker. And if they didn't have a speaker, there wouldn't be a party. So he said, my chief, he said, the reason we're here is to ask you to step into the role of Hitsati, or housemaster. I told him I didn't know all the duties of a Hitsatsi. Ray Wilson, who was a clan leader of the Kiksati, he belonged to my mother's dance group for quite a while before he got another dance group together. And he stood up and he said, what you've been doing as a... My mother had turned the dance group over to me. And Ray said, what you've been doing as a dance group leader is pretty much the same as a Hitsati. So I said, well, okay, I'll step into that role. And I was given the name it used to belong to my uncle Frank Kitka. He had several names. One of his names was Ganuska Ish. Another name that was his, excuse me, that was a name that was given to me. It was Kaete Duacht, which meant the cry of a raven when somebody walks by on the trail. And my grandfather, my dad's father, gave me his name. He's a dog salmon. And that name was Ukchats. When the salmon are in seawater, a lot of times they're, really hard to tell which is which. But when they hit fresh water, they start changing. So the male hopi grows a big hump on its back, and its teeth start growing until they look like fangs. So that was my grandfather's name, Ukchats, and he gave it to me.
Cheese, thank you. This is the relative of mine who gave me the picture of my grandmother. He's my relative. We only have a minute. If Dr. Smythe would come up and encourage us and tell us what we can do to impress the city to rename what they are thinking of as the Willoughby District, and what we can do to make it a more meaningful name.
Gunakchish. Well, there have been a number of events of initiatives by the city to gather input on various areas of the city and how to memorialize events that took place there and how to present the Juneau history. And so one of them is called Wayfinding. So I'd encourage people to turn out to those events. And there's also a historic preservation plan that's being reviewed at the present time. So I'd encourage people to participate in those events when you see them in the paper, to come forward and give your perspectives like this. It's very important. And the more of these voices, the more people come forward and express this. The city is being responsive. We've experienced that, and I think they will continue to be responsive. So I'd encourage you to follow up as you're describing.
Is there a preferred name that we can endorse, advocate?
Well, I don't know the latest. I know there's reservations about the Willoughby District, and even to the idea of it being a cultural district, as if that's the only part of the city that's a cultural area. So it's pretty open-ended, I think, at the present time, and I think there's an opening here to think about different ways. I mean, I've suggested we call it, the village district, the Indian Village District, or the Juneau Indian Village District, or the Auk Village. On the early maps, it was called Auk Village, and then it became the Indian Village, or the Juneau Indian Village. But the earliest maps show it as Auk Village.
Auk Village District.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
So that's a possibility. One thing I might mention, has been a long thing of mine I've been looking for, but in about 1963 or 62, there were the first hearings in the city on so-called urban renewal, and that was to what to do about the village, because they wanted to clear it out and make room for apartments and other buildings and on that fill. And those hearings have been lost. They were public hearings, and I tracked down the woman who was the transcriber and took, using one of those old court machines to transcribe what was said. But she told me that there was no record of it because she gained her income from the way they weren't commissioned to do that. Only way she could earn money from doing that was by charging for copies. And so she never kept a copy. And I don't know where the copy are, but it's all the voices from the village who came forward and talked about what life was like in the village in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so that would be a huge, so anyone, keep that in the back of your mind, because that would be a hugely important document for understanding the Juneau Indian Village at that time. But anyway, thank you. Oh, we have this, Dr. Thornton has a
comment. Ernestine said that I think any effort that does it should teach about how much the landscape has changed as a result of the mining and reclaiming what was the tidelands, because there's a modest effort to do that in this walkway, but it's a major re-engineering essentially of that area, and I think most people don't know anything about that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think part of this wayfinding effort is through signage to show where the original coastline was.
Wow.
In this whole area, starting down by the cruise ship docks, past the cold storage, and all the way up. So that's one idea. Yeah.
Chuck, I was just going to say, I don't think it's a heavy lift to change the name of the district from Willoughby. I think the challenge is to coalesce around a name, and I think it's one that the Kalinka community in particular should focus on, because I think if there is a united voice, it will not be a struggle with the Assembly or the Planning Commission. But I think what is going to be important is to have a process that ultimately coalesces around one or two names that are regarded as acceptable to the community. My 2 cents.
So yeah, so let's go. Get your voices be heard in this process. Yes.
Corinna. I also just wanted to add also the Downtown Blueprint Steering Committee.
That's the other one.
And
Yes.
I'm one of the people on that,
Yeah.
as well as others. So that's just another voice in the community.
Yeah, that's another initiative that the city is doing to again, talk about through signage and other means what's important, what's the history here, what's the long-term history, the multi-ethnic history of this area. What I've seen that it's been very successful in gaining multi-vocalic representations of that history. So, well, thank you very much for a great talk and starting a dialogue.
First of all, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming here. And I also wanted to thank Juneauites for supporting the kind of efforts that we've been trying to make in terms of the cultural recognition of the Native people of Southeast Alaska. And we really wanted to thank our mayor for naming our square there Heritage Square, and we just did that kind of, spontaneously. But to me, it represented a willingness and a change that I've seen, here in Juneau. And I've been here in Juneau probably longer than anybody here in this room, even the mayor. And so I know that there's change. And I will say that my understanding is that Rosa Miller and Fran, who now speaks, who's the spokesperson now, and they have like 100 names behind them of the Auk people, and they've agreed that we should support, the renaming of that district to the Auk Village District. So that is something, and maybe we will just formalize it in a letter. Although we have met with some of those planning people and told them. But I have to confess that we don't always attend public meetings in the same way that other people attend public meetings. Maybe we should, but we don't. And we asked for a meeting from the Native community, and we did meet with them here in this room, and we sent a lot of our recommendations forward. So hopefully that'll be there. But I do want to thank Juno, and I do want to thank the residents who I've seen really come around and support us, not only in Heritage Parks, but like at Indian Point, a most sacred site to us. So thank you all, Juno people. And thank you, Ernestine, for keeping up that great work.